Lin Hao had always been a cautious man. He didn't take risks. His career was built on the predictable, the controllable, everything in its place, every calculation precise. The world of science, with its cold logic and undeniable facts, was where he felt safest. But even in the most sterile of labs, the unpredictable sometimes had a way of creeping in. It was a quiet Friday morning when everything changed. Lin Hao was alone in the high-tech genetics lab at Futura Biotech, a research facility at the cutting edge of gene editing. The air smelled faintly of sterilizer and metal. A row of machines beeped steadily, their monotony only broken by the occasional clink of his keyboard or the rustling of papers as he flipped through research notes. This was his life's work, pushing the boundaries of human biology, of human potential. He had been part of the team responsible for one of the most ambitious experiments in genetic history, an experiment aimed at enhancing human abilities through the integration of animal DNA. It sounded like science fiction, but it was only a matter of time before science fiction became science fact. Lin Hao's contribution was the final touch, creating a gene sequence that would integrate the abilities of several animals into human DNA, strength from ants, vision from hawks, speed from cheetahs, and resilience from marine creatures. The theory was simple: create a perfect human hybrid capable of surviving in any environment, a kind of ultimate being. He had spent years getting to this point. Years of trials, failures, and tiny successes. Today was supposed to be just another test, a final adjustment before they began testing on animals. But that was when the mistake happened. Lin Hao was adjusting a gene sequence, one that would synchronize the traits from different animals, when a flash of light burst from the machine. The sudden surge of electrical power sent a jolt through his body, a sharp pain racing from his spine to his fingertips. He felt as if his bones were being torn apart and remade, rewritten. His vision blurred, his mind spun out of control, and then, nothing. When Lin Hao woke up, he was lying on the cold tile floor of the lab, his head throbbing. At first, everything seemed blurry, his vision wasn't quite right. He could see the fluorescent lights above him, but they seemed too bright, too intense. There was a strange feeling in the air, like the world had shifted. He pushed himself up onto his elbows, his body feeling different somehow. More attuned. He could hear the hum of the air conditioning clearly, the soft rhythm of the lab's machinery, but there was something else too. The distant sound of birds outside, the faintest rustling of leaves. His hearing was more acute than it had ever been. Hello? His voice sounded strange to his own ears, sharper, more focused. He stood up slowly, feeling a wave of dizziness wash over him. But as he straightened, something inside his mind clicked, and his vision snapped into focus. The lab was a maze of high-tech equipment, but now, each detail was clear to him. He could see the smallest imperfections on the walls, the tiny dust particles drifting in the air. He saw the faint crack in the glass of the window across the room, the frayed edge of the carpet. But it wasn't just the details that struck him. It was the clarity, the precision. He could see it all, as if his eyes were now perfect lenses, fine-tuned to see beyond what the human eye should be able to perceive. A sudden impulse took over him, and he looked at his watch. The numbers on the face jumped out at him with startling clarity, and he was able to calculate exactly how much time had passed since the accident. 3 hours, he muttered to himself. He should have felt overwhelmed. Confused. Terrified. But instead, an odd sense of exhilaration surged through him. This was new. This was power. As the fog lifted from his mind, Lin Hao moved toward the door. The hallway outside was quiet. His footsteps were silent on the floor, but his hearing picked up everything: the soft whisper of paper fluttering in the breeze from an open window, the faint thump of someone's heart several doors down. He paused, the heartbeats. It was as if his ears were tuned to frequencies no normal human could detect. The rhythmic pounding of blood in his ears sounded different, like a second pulse, one that wasn't his own. It was sharp, precise, faster. He could hear everything. Every heartbeat, every breath, every footstep echoing down the hallway. This is what it feels like to be an apex predator, isn't it? The thought crossed his mind, and a jolt of pure instinct followed. His muscles tensed, his mind raced, but before he could fully process what was happening, a burst of energy shot through him. He sprang forward, sprinting faster than he had ever run in his life. His legs moved with a speed that was beyond comprehension. He didn't feel tired. In fact, he felt as if he could keep going forever. He bolted down the hallway, rounding a corner without breaking stride, his mind still processing everything that was happening. He barely noticed the shift. The world around him became a blur, every motion of his body synchronized perfectly with his surroundings, but then, suddenly, it hit him. He had lost control. With a sharp twist of his body, he skidded to a halt, his feet scraping the polished floor. He was out of breath, his heart pounding in his chest, but, no, he wasn't tired. His legs were trembling, but they were not sore. They were restless, eager for more. A hunter's body, his body, was trying to run on its own, without his mind's input. It was the power, the urge to chase, the need to hunt that he swallowed hard, realizing that his body had become something other than human. His senses had sharpened beyond reason. And as he took a deep breath, the overwhelming scent of the outside world flooded his nose, the rain, the earth, the distant traffic. His heart raced. What had he done? He stumbled back to the lab, mind reeling. The computer was still running, but the data on the screen now showed something different. The sequence he had programmed, the one that had gone wrong, was still flashing in a pattern he couldn't understand. His own DNA had been altered, infused with the genes of multiple animals. Eagle eyes. Cheetah speed. Ant strength. The transformation was irreversible. Lin Hao's initial excitement began to give way to confusion and, eventually, fear. The abilities that had initially seemed so exhilarating, his newfound vision, his enhanced speed, the sharpness of his senses, began to feel more like a curse than a gift. The things he had once taken for granted, like human connection, like empathy, felt distant, alien. His mind couldn't quite hold on to the fleeting moments of clarity. Overwhelmed by the pull of instinct that he turned away from the computer, his hands shaking. There was a gnawing hunger inside him, something deep and primal. His thoughts raced, but they didn't feel like his own anymore. The voices in his head, like the roaring sound of blood rushing through his ears, were louder now. Overbearing, the animal instincts were starting to take over. By the time Lin Hao left the lab that day, he didn't know who, or what, he was anymore. The man who had entered the lab hours ago, the calm scientist who prided himself on logic and control, had been replaced by something else. Something wild. The city stretched out before him, the familiar streets now seeming alien. He was no longer just a man. He had become something more. Something less. Something in between, and the jungle was calling. Lin Hao's feet hit the pavement in a blur of motion. The city streets, once familiar and comforting, now felt like an alien landscape. The familiar hum of traffic, the conversations of pedestrians, the distant clink of construction, everything seemed muted, as though filtered through a fog. But it wasn't the world that had changed, it was him. His senses were overloaded, attuned to details that had once been invisible, imperceptible. It was like he had been given a pair of superhuman eyes, ears, a nose, and every sensory organ in between. But what he hadn't realized when he first sprinted out of the lab was just how much his mind would struggle to keep up. His heart raced, not from the exertion. He wasn't tired, not at all, but from the surge of raw energy coursing through his veins. His senses were screaming at him. A car engine revved a block away, and it sounded like a lion's roar in his ears. A child's laughter echoed from a park around the corner, and he could pick out the individual notes like a symphony. He could smell the staleness of the air conditioning in a nearby office building, the sweat and leather of the commuters on the sidewalk, the faint scent of something sweet and floral from a street vendor. All of it was overwhelming. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was how deeply his mind wanted to follow each of those sensory impulses. The urge to chase the source of every sound, every movement, every smell gnawed at him. It wasn't curiosity, it was something deeper. More primal. He stopped abruptly, forcing himself to breathe slowly, to steady his thoughts. There was no need to run. There was no need to chase. He was not some wild animal, some predator, some mindless thing driven by hunger and instinct. But that was the lie, wasn't it? His hands trembled as he dug his fingers into the rough brick of a nearby building, grounding himself. He closed his eyes and took another breath. Just breathe. For a moment, everything went still. The rush of adrenaline slowed, the wild thoughts quieted. He could hear his own pulse in his ears, a steady rhythm that seemed to tether him to reality. But then the sound of a car honking nearby broke through, and his body stiffened. His vision sharpened instinctively, every detail of the vehicle, its paint job, the scratches on the hood, the face of the driver, flooded his mind in an instant. What was happening to him? The question lingered in the back of his mind like a ghost. He couldn't escape it. He should be terrified, confused, but instead, it was like everything that had once felt like a limitation, his human weaknesses, his smallness, had been stripped away. He was powerful now. Invincible, even. He was more than a man. But was that a gift? Or a curse? The answer didn't come to him. All he had were the sensations. The overwhelming, all-consuming need to explore them, to push them to their limits. To see just how far this new body, this new life, could take him. His fingers gripped the brick tighter as he willed himself to focus. But his body, his new, enhanced body, was already acting on its own. Without thinking, he crouched, his knees bending like a coiled spring. He felt the pull of gravity, the pressure of his legs, the tension in his muscles. He could feel the earth beneath him, the energy of the world waiting to be tapped into, and then he sprang, the world turned into a streak of motion. His legs stretched, propelled him forward with an almost supernatural speed. He didn't need to think. He just did. In seconds, he was crossing intersections, leaping over barriers, darting between pedestrians. The blur of movement was a thrill, an intoxicating rush of freedom. But it was also terrifying. He couldn't stop, couldn't slow down. His feet didn't seem to touch the ground, they barely skimmed it. He was flying across the city, faster than anything human could move. He willed himself to stop. A moment of clarity amidst the madness. And then, with a sharp twist, his body obeyed, skidding to a halt in the middle of an alleyway, his heart pounding wildly, his body trembling with the intensity of the sprint. He gasped for breath, but it wasn't from exhaustion. It was from the sheer force of the adrenaline that had surged through him. His mind was still racing, still trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened. He could still hear the sound of his heartbeat in his ears, the constant rush of blood that felt almost alien. Was this the price of his new powers? The constant hum of heightened senses, the ever-present rush of strength and speed? Something clicked inside him then. Something darker. A deeper hunger that had begun to gnaw at his gut, a gnawing, insatiable desire to run again. To feel that speed, that power. To push the limits, to test his boundaries. That he had no idea where he was anymore. No idea how far he had run. The streetlights above cast harsh shadows on the ground, and the city seemed distant now, alien, as if he were outside of it looking in. He could see the shadows of people walking, but they were just that, shadows. Faint outlines in his vision. He was something else now. Something apart from them. A soft scuffle behind him caught his attention. He turned sharply, his body already tense. It was a woman, standing at the edge of the alley, staring at him with wide eyes. Her breath came fast, as if she'd been running too. She looked at him like he was a wild animal, something to be feared, something to avoid. Lin Hao didn't move. His enhanced vision caught the detail of her face, the nervous twitch in her cheek, the rapid rise and fall of her chest. He could smell the faint scent of her perfume, the anxiety radiating off of her. But what really caught his attention was the sharp fear in her eyes. He took a step forward. No, he told himself. Control. But the instinct, that deep, gnawing instinct, was there again. His body took another step forward, almost involuntarily. He could feel it now, the animal in him stirring, the predatory impulse. She was small, fragile. For a moment, his vision blurred. The world tilted, his thoughts spinning. She was prey. She was weak. He stopped. Lin Hao blinked, shook his head. His heart thundered in his chest. He was human. He wasn't some animal. The woman, sensing the shift, slowly took a step back. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. You don't look well." The words hung in the air like a fog. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had asked him that. He couldn't remember the last time he had thought to answer. He looked at her, then down at his hands. They were trembling. His whole body was on edge. His senses screamed at him to act, to chase, to hunt, to run. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to focus. "I'm fine," he said, the words slipping out in a hoarse whisper. "Just tired." His voice sounded alien to him, too sharp, too tense. He couldn't remember the last time he had spoken with such distance, such disconnection. She didn't look convinced, but she nodded, slowly backing away. Lin Hao stood there for a moment longer, watching her disappear into the darkened streets. The adrenaline began to recede, and a wave of exhaustion hit him. Not physical exhaustion, but something deeper, more profound. The kind that came from being pushed to your limits and realizing that you couldn't control it anymore. He staggered back against the brick wall of the alley, his legs weak. His mind was still spinning. What had just happened? Was he really losing himself? Was he becoming the monster that he had always feared? The thought hung in the air, oppressive, suffocating. He was no longer sure where the line between man and animal was anymore. The jungle, the real jungle, wasn't some distant, untouched place. It was right here, in his own veins, in his own mind, and he didn't know if he could stop it. Lin Hao woke up in his apartment to the sound of birds chirping outside. He had no idea how long he'd been asleep, but the faint light of dawn creeping through his window told him it had been at least a few hours. He sat up, rubbing his face, feeling the weight of exhaustion in his muscles. Not the kind of fatigue that comes from overexertion, but the kind that lingers, heavy and suffocating, as though his body was still recalibrating itself. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and stood, swaying for a moment before steadying himself. He hadn't run like that in. God, how long had it been? His mind kept drifting back to the alley, to the woman's terrified eyes, and to that moment when the animal inside him had taken over. He could still feel the raw hunger coursing through him, the almost irresistible urge to hunt, but that wasn't who he was. Was it? Lin Hao closed his eyes and took a deep breath, forcing his thoughts to quiet down. He needed control. He had to regain control. His body was no longer entirely his own, and that terrified him. There was a wildness inside him now, an instinct that wasn't human. It had taken hold with such ease, slipping through the cracks in his consciousness, finding the weak spots. It was seductive, like a drug. It promised freedom, power, and freedom from weakness. But it came at a cost. He had seen it in the eyes of that woman, the fear, the distrust. He wasn't just changing physically. He was changing in ways that scared him. He stumbled into the bathroom, catching his reflection in the mirror. For the first time in days, he really looked at himself. The transformation had begun. His eyes were sharper, almost predatory, the pupils too wide. His skin was paler, the veins more pronounced beneath the surface. His face seemed harder, sharper, as though the features of a different creature had slowly worked their way through his human exterior. But his gaze, there was something darker there now. Something primal. Something that didn't belong. He ran his fingers over his face, touching the jagged line of his cheekbone, the roughness of his jaw. He barely recognized himself. It was as though he were wearing someone else's face. Or something else's. His stomach twisted, and he had to grip the edge of the sink to steady himself. He was slipping away. Every passing moment, the man he used to be seemed to fade further into the distance. Suddenly, a flash of motion in the corner of his vision caught his attention. Without thinking, his eyes snapped to the movement. It was just a shadow in the alley below, but to his heightened senses, it was as clear as day. He could hear the shuffle of footsteps, the distinct sound of someone small, someone weak, moving down the street. He blinked hard, trying to shake off the compulsion to follow. It wasn't just curiosity now, it was a need. A drive. To chase. To track. The instincts of the predator were no longer a whisper in the back of his mind, they were a roaring tide, drowning everything else out. He turned away from the mirror, clenching his fists, forcing himself to focus on something, anything other than the raw urge to pursue. For a moment, it felt like he might lose himself entirely, like the beast inside would win. But then, as the minutes passed, Lin Hao began to feel something else, something more human. A quiet voice, his voice, fighting back against the animal inside him. It reminded him of who he used to be. Who he still was, somewhere beneath the layers of instinct and impulse. The scientist. The man who had dreamed of changing the world. He couldn't let it slip away. Not like this, but the jungle was louder now. It was in his blood, his bones, a constant hum beneath his thoughts. It was pulling at him, promising him power. Freedom from weakness. And all he had to do was let go. It wasn't enough. Not yet. With one last shudder, Lin Hao forced himself to leave the apartment, stepping out into the morning air, letting the cool breeze wash over him. The city felt different today. His senses were more attuned than ever before. He could hear the faintest hum of the city, the distant sounds of people talking, the rattle of a garbage truck several blocks away. He could smell the fresh bread from a nearby bakery, the sharp tang of motor oil, the earthiness of rain that had just passed, but as much as his instinct screamed to chase, to pounce, he had to hold it back. He had to remember who he was. But it was becoming harder to remember. As he walked through the streets, he felt people looking at him. They didn't know what had happened to him. They didn't know the animal that had taken root inside his soul. All they saw was a man, a normal man, walking down the street. But Lin Hao could feel their fear. Their wariness. He could hear it in their heartbeats, see it in their eyes. They knew, on some level, that something wasn't right. He was a predator, and the world was starting to recognize him for what he was. The thought made his chest tighten. He didn't want to be this. He didn't want to be feared. He didn't want to be alone. But his transformation was irreversible. There was no going back. Not now. Not after everything he'd seen. Not after everything he'd become. As he turned down a side street, he spotted a group of people gathered around, looking down at something in the middle of the street. His curiosity piqued. Lin Hao approached cautiously, trying to ignore the gnawing hunger that was still tugging at his insides. He tried to remain human, but it was hard. So hard. A woman stood at the center of the crowd, her face contorted in distress. Lin Hao stepped forward, recognizing her instantly. It was the same woman from the alley last night, the one he had almost hunted. Her eyes locked with his the moment he stepped into view, and for a brief, terrible second, Lin Hao saw the flicker of recognition. The same fear. The same dread, and then, without thinking, he moved. The crowd parted as his body surged forward, his legs carrying him faster than he intended, too fast for his brain to keep up. He could see the woman's expression change. She wasn't just scared anymore, she was terrified. She knew. She could feel the animal in him now. She could sense the predatory energy in the air, just like everyone else could, but it was too late. He was there before she could react, his hand grabbing her wrist with a force that made her gasp. Her heart pounded in his ears, and for a brief moment, Lin Hao thought he might actually hurt her. That the wild, uncontrollable part of him might take over again, but then he froze. She stared up at him, her eyes wide, pupils dilated in fear. He could feel the warmth of her body, the quick, shallow breaths that matched his own, the pounding of her heart that made everything inside him scream to protect. It was as if something deep inside him was reminding him of the balance he had to maintain. He let go. Lin Hao pulled his hand away, stepping back. The hunger was still there, but the beast inside him had quieted. For now. The woman, still trembling, stepped away from him, her gaze never leaving his. I am sorry," she stammered, her voice shaking. "I didn't know. I didn't know what happened to you, but, you're not." Her words trailed off, and Lin Hao found himself at a loss. He wanted to tell her he was sorry. That he wasn't dangerous. That he wasn't a monster. But all that came out was a low growl. His body trembled. "I'm not. I'm still me," he said hoarsely, his voice raw, cracked. He wasn't sure if he was speaking to her or to himself. She didn't answer. She just turned and walked away, her footsteps quick and frantic. Lin Hao watched her disappear, feeling something inside him break. This was the world he had created. This was the life he had built with his own hands, and it was slipping away, piece by piece. He wasn't human anymore. Not really. Not completely. He turned, walking slowly down the street, his body heavy with the weight of the truth. There was no going back. He had become something else, something greater, and yet, in some ways, far, far smaller than he had ever been. The law of the jungle had always been about survival. About the strong ruling over the weak. But what if you were both the predator and the prey, and what if, in the end, there was nothing left to save?